The vibration of a Detroit Diesel 671 is not something you hear. It is something you feel in the marrow of your shin bones. It is a coarse, rhythmic shudder that travels up through the diamond plate steel of the deck, through the soles of your boots, and settles in your teeth. I had spent the last 40 minutes listening to that specific frequency, my head tilted just so, trying to isolate a harmonic whine that should not have been there. It was the port side hydraulic pump. It had to be. The cavitation sound was faint, like gravel being shaken in a tin can, buried under the roar of the exhaust. I wiped a smear of molly grease from my knuckles onto a rag that had long since ceased to be absorbent. The air out here on the Willamette River was heavy, saturated with the kind of biting moisture that defines an Oregon November. It was not raining, not exactly, but the mist was thick enough to bead on the cold steel of the safety railings and drip into the gray swirl of the current below. I was the sole operator and mechanic for the Marie E, a cable ferry that shuttled vehicles 200 yards across the river, connecting a rural county road to the highway artery on the west bank. It was a simple machine, brutal in its efficiency, a flat steel barge guided by a 1-inch thick submerged steel cable, pulled back and forth by a hydraulic winch system. No rudder, no prop, no steering. Just a relentless game of tug-of-war with a steel rope. I checked the pressure gauge on the main manifold. 2,200 psi. Steady. The needle did not even twitch. So why the whine? I stepped out of the small engine doghouse and walked to the edge of the hull, looking down at the water. The river was high, swollen by weeks of mountain runoff. The current was pushing against the upstream flank of the barge, creating a turbulent bow wave that slapped rhythmically against the metal. The guide cables, 2 distinct steel lines running from shore to shore, were taut, humming under the strain of holding 80 tons of steel against the flow of the Willamette. I looked toward the west bank. The landing ramp was empty. It was 4:15 p.m. on a Tuesday. Usually there would be 3 or 4 pickups waiting, engines idling, exhaust plumes rising in the cold air. Commuters from the lumber yards or the paper mill. Today, the concrete slipway was bare. I squinted. The mist blurred the tree line, turning the Douglas firs into jagged, dark teeth against the charcoal sky. Something was wrong with the traffic on the highway beyond the trees, about a mile out. I could usually hear the steady whoosh, whoosh of tires on wet asphalt. Today, the sound was a continuous, angry drone. Horns. Thousands of them. A dissonant chord of panic that carried over the water. Then I saw the smoke. It was not the white steam of the paper mill. This was black, oily smoke, rising in a column thick enough to punch a hole in the overcast layer. It was coming from the direction of the bridge in Salem, 10 miles south. I did not panic. Panic is a waste of calories. I'm a mechanic. I diagnose. I walked back to the wheelhouse, a small aluminum box elevated 6 feet above the deck on steel stanchions. I climbed the ladder, the cold rungs biting into my palms through my gloves. Inside, the heater was fighting a losing battle against the drafty windows. I picked up the heavy radio mic, the coil cord stiff with cold. County Dispatch, this is Ferry 1. Radio check. Static. Not the clean hiss of an open channel, but a garbled, layered mess of voices stepping over one another, screaming, sobbing. The squelch broke, and a voice, high-pitched, breathless, cut through. Overrun at the intersection. They're pulling people out of the cars. Oh God, do not stop, just drive through them. I released the talk button. I stood there, looking through the rain-streaked glass at the west bank. A pickup truck burst out of the tree line. It was moving too fast for the gravel access road. It slewed sideways, correcting violently, sending a spray of mud into the blackberry bushes. It was not slowing down for the landing ramp. It hit the concrete incline at 40 miles an hour. The driver slammed on the brakes too late. The truck locked up, tires screaming, sliding down the wet algae-slicked concrete toward the water. It stopped with its front bumper dipping into the river, 10 yards short of where the ferry would have been docked if I had not been midstream running diagnostics. The driver's door flew open. A man scrambled out. He did not look at the ferry. He did not wave. He looked back up the road he had just come down. He scrambled into the bed of his truck, fumbling with something, a shotgun. Then they came out of the trees. At this distance, 200 yards away, they looked like ants, a swarm. But ants do not move with that jerky, frantic coordination. They poured down the road, a fluid mass of limbs and tearing clothes. The man in the truck fired. I saw the puff of smoke, heard the pop a second later, but the swarm washed over the truck bed like a tide coming in. I watched him disappear. I watched the truck rock on its suspension as the weight of the bodies piled onto it. I did not reach for a weapon. I reached for the control lever of the hydraulic winch. My hand hovered over the joystick. Instinct screamed to run. But run where? The East Bank? That was farm country, flat and open. If the highway was gone, the farm roads would be next. The river was the only barrier. And I was standing on a floating fortress of quarter-inch plate steel. I engaged the drive. The hydraulics groaned, the bull wheels bit into the cable, and the ferry lurched. But I did not head for shore. I feathered the control, bringing the vessel to a dead halt exactly in the center of the channel, the deepest part of the river. I killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy. The roar of the diesel died away, leaving only the rushing sound of the water and the distant, terrifying noise from the shore, a sound like dry leaves being crushed, magnified 1,000 times. I was anchored. The first problem was physics. A cable ferry is not designed to sit midstream indefinitely. The river current pushes against the side of the hull, creating massive drag. That force is transferred to the guide cables, and then to the shore anchors, massive concrete deadmen buried deep in the mudbanks. If I stayed here, the tension on those cables would be immense. But if I cut the cables, the ferry would drift downstream, unpowered and uncontrollable, until it smashed into a bridge piling or grounded on a sandbar. I needed to secure the position mechanically. The hydraulic brake on the winch was good, but it relied on hydraulic pressure. If a seal blew, or if the engine was off for too long and the pressure bled down, the bullwheel would slip. The current would push the ferry toward the ocean, spinning the freewheeling winch until we hit the end of the slack and snap. Catastrophic failure. I had to lock the drivetrain manually. I grabbed my tool bag from the bench in the wheelhouse. It weighed 40 pounds, canvas, grease-stained, filled with the holy trinity of survival, leverage, impact, and cutting power. I climbed down to the main deck. The wind had picked up, cutting down the river channel, stinging my face. I walked to the winch housing. It was a steel enclosure in the center of the deck, covering the massive gears and the bull wheels that gripped the underwater cable. I knelt on the cold steel, unlatching the inspection hatch. Inside, the smell was comforting. 90-weight gear oil and hot metal. The main drive gear was a ring of steel teeth 2 feet in diameter. It was held stationary by the hydraulic holding valve right now, but I could see the micro-movements, the tiny shudders as the river battered the hull. The hydraulics were fighting a war of attrition. I needed a dog, a physical wedge to jam the gears. I scanned the deck. I did not have a dedicated locking pin. The engineers had not designed this boat for the apocalypse. They designed it for 5-minute crossings. I ran to the storage locker at the stern. Inside were spare parts, chains, and emergency flares. I dug through the pile until my hand closed around a grade 8 bolt, 1 inch in diameter and 10 inches long, used for mounting the sheave blocks. It was high tensile steel, strong enough to hold a skyscraper together. I ran back to the winch housing. The gap between the teeth of the main gear was tight. I checked the alignment.
If I could drill a hole through the steel casing of the housing and slide the bolt through, it would slot between the gear teeth, acting as a dead stop. I pulled out my cordless Milwaukee drill and a set of cobalt bits. This was the moment where the quality of your tools determined if you lived or died. Cheap bits would snap or dull against the hardened steel of the winch casing. I slotted a 1/4-inch pilot bit into the chuck. I leaned my weight into the drill, pressing the tip against the 1/2-inch plate of the housing. I pulled the trigger. The motor whined, a high-pitched scream that harmonized with the wind. Blue smoke curled up from the tip as the bit bit into the metal. I applied cutting fluid from a small squirt bottle in my pocket, careful not to waste a drop. Keep it straight. Do not work hard in the metal. The pilot hole punched through. I switched to the 1/2-inch bit, then the 3/4, and finally, the 1-inch reamer. My wrists ached from the torque. The cold was seeping through my Carhartt jacket, numbing my shoulders, but the exertion kept the blood moving. 40 minutes. That's how long it took to bore a clean hole through the casing. I slid the grade 8 bolt into the hole. It clanked against the side of a gear tooth. I had to rotate the winch slightly to align the gap. I scrambled back up the ladder to the wheelhouse. I started the engine. The roar startled me, sounding impossibly loud in the new, quiet world. I feathered the joystick, moving the FERRY inches against the current. Clunk. I felt it through the floor. The bolt had dropped into the slot between the gear teeth. I killed the engine immediately. The FERRY drifted back a fraction of an inch, and then, thud, the gear teeth slammed against the bolt. The bolt held. The stress was off the hydraulics. The stress was now purely on that 1 inch of high tensile steel shear strength. I sat on the floor of the winch housing, catching my breath. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the vibration of the drill. I checked the bolt. It was under tension, jammed tight, but it was not bending. Step 1 complete. I was not going anywhere. Now, the systems check. I did a mental inventory of the Marie E. She was 80 feet long, 30 feet wide. Flat deck. No cabin, just the elevated wheelhouse and the small engine doghouse. Water. There was a 5-gallon cooler in the wheelhouse. Half full. Maybe 2 days if I rationed. Food. My lunchbox. 1 ham sandwich, an apple, a bag of chips, and a thermos of coffee. That was it. Fuel. The main tank held 500 gallons of red dye diesel. I had filled it yesterday. At idle, the Detroit burned maybe a gallon an hour. But I did not need to idle. I only needed power for heat and battery charging. The generator, a smaller Kubota unit, burned a quart an hour. I had power for months, provided the generator did not fail. Shelter. The wheelhouse was uninsulated aluminum. It was going to be a freezer box tonight. I stood up and walked to the rail. The sun was setting, a bruised purple bruise spreading across the western sky. The fires on the shore were brighter now, orange, jagged lines reflecting in the black water. The swarm on the ramp had dispersed. They were wandering now, aimless silhouettes against the firelight. I saw one of them walk into the river. It did not swim. It just kept walking until the water was over its head. It did not come back up. I shivered. The cold was a physical weight. I needed to secure the perimeter. On a boat, that means controlling access from the water. The freeboard, the distance from the water to the deck, was only about 3 feet. A determined swimmer could pull themselves up, or a determined whatever those things were. I went to the chain locker. I pulled out 4 coils of heavy logging chain, the links thick as my thumb. I dragged them along the perimeter of the deck, the steel rasping against the non-slip coating. It was heavy, brutal work. My lower back screamed. I did not have enough chain to fence the whole deck. I had to be smart. I draped the chains over the gunnels at the lowest points of the hull, letting the ends dangle into the water. If something tried to climb up, the loose chains would swing and clatter against the hull. A primitive alarm system.
Next, I raided the tool locker for every C-clamp I owned. I clamped spare lengths of angle iron and rebar to the top of the railing, sharpening the ends with my angle grinder until sparks showered into the river like fireworks. It was not a wall. It was a discouragement. If they tried to grab the rail, they'd lose a hand. By the time I finished, it was fully dark. The only light came from the fires on shore and the faint green glow of the instrument panel in the wheelhouse. I climbed back up into the booth. I locked the door. It was a flimsy lock, a standard commercial latch that could be kicked in by a child. I drilled a hole through the door frame and the door itself, sliding a heavy screwdriver through it. A deadbolt made of hardened tool steel. I sat in the captain's chair. The vinyl was cracked and cold. I wrapped my jacket tighter around myself. I looked at the water gauge. 2.5 gallons. I looked at the river. Millions of gallons. All of it poison. The Willamette is an agricultural runoff sewer on a good day. Now, with bodies in it, it was a biohazard. Thirst would be the first ghost to visit me. I picked up the thermos. It was still warm. I poured a cup of coffee, the steam rising in the dark. I did not drink it. I just held it, letting the heat soak into my palms. The ferry groaned. The steel cable underwater was singing, a high-pitched vibration caused by the current rushing over it. It sounded like a cello being played with a hacksaw. It was the sound of tension. The sound of something holding on by its fingernails. I watched the shore. A car was burning on the highway, the flames illuminating a billboard for a personal injury lawyer. Injured? We fight for you. Not anymore, I whispered. My voice sounded rusty, foreign. I took a sip of the coffee. It was bitter, strong, and the best thing I had ever tasted. I placed the cup down and picked up my logbook. I clicked my pen. Date, November 14th. Time, 1900 hours. Location, Station 44, mid-channel. Status, anchored. Drive gear locked. Perimeter secured. Supplies, critical. Souls on board, 1. I closed the book. I watched the river flow past, black and indifferent, carrying the wreckage of the world toward the sea. I was a mechanic. My job was to fix things. But looking at the fire reflected in the water, I knew there was no fixing this. There was only enduring it. I checked the voltage on the battery bank one last time. 24 1-volts. Good. I leaned back, eyes open, listening to the water slap against the hull, waiting for the first scratch at the door. The cold woke me before the light did. It was a pervasive, damp intruder that bypassed the fabric of my jacket and settled directly into the joints of my fingers. I sat up in the captain's chair, my neck popping with a sound like dry twigs snapping. Condensation had frosted the inside of the aluminum wheelhouse windows. I wiped a porthole with my sleeve. The world outside was a grayscale smear of fog and river water. The shore was invisible, swallowed by the mist, but I could still hear them. The moan of the infected had changed. Yesterday it was a chaotic shriek of predation. Today it was a low, ambient drone, like the hum of a distant electrical substation. They were still there. They were not leaving. I checked my watch. 0600. My throat felt like it had been scrubbed with 80 grit sandpaper. I reached for the water jug. It was lighter than I remembered. I took a sip, holding the liquid in my mouth to wet my gums before swallowing. That was the math of my death. 2 gallons left. A human male, exerting himself in near-freezing temperatures, loses moisture just by breathing. The vapor cloud I exhaled every few seconds was literally my life escaping into the atmosphere. Without intake, I had 3 days of cognitive function, maybe 4, before my kidneys shut down. I looked at the river below, the Willamette. It was millions of gallons of flowing salvation. But it was a trap. Even before the collapse, this water was a cocktail of agricultural nitrates, heavy metals from the old mills, and runoff from the Portland sewer overflow. Now, it was a corpse soup. Boiling it would kill the bacteria, the cholera and the giardia, but it would not remove the chemical toxins or the heavy metals. Distillation was possible, but it required fuel, complex glassware, and time I did not have. I needed the sky. This was Oregon. Rain was the state's primary export. But catching it was not as simple as putting a bucket on the deck. The wind on the river whipped rain sideways. A bucket would catch a pint a day, maybe less. I needed surface area. I needed a catchment system. I exited the wheelhouse, locking the dead-bolted door behind me. The wind on the catwalk was biting. I scanned the ferry's structure with a contractor's eye, ignoring the horror on the shore and focusing on geometry. The wheelhouse roof. It was a sheet of corrugated aluminum, roughly 8 feet by 10 feet, 80 square feet of catchment area. A 1-inch rainstorm on that surface would yield... I did the mental arithmetic. 1 inch of rain on 1 square foot is 623 gallons. 80 square feet times 623, roughly 50 gallons. A single storm could keep me alive for a month. But the roof was designed to shed water, not keep it. It was slightly crowned, dumping runoff over the eaves onto the deck below, where it mixed with grease, diesel soot, and bird droppings before flowing into the river. I needed to intercept that water before it hit the dirty deck. I climbed down to the main deck and headed for the maintenance locker. I needed materials. The locker was a treasure trove of the mundane. No guns, no MREs, just the glorious debris of industrial maintenance. I bypassed the socket sets and went straight to the rack of conduit. There were 3 lengths of 3-inch Schedule 40 PVC pipe left over from a rewiring job on the shore ramps, 10 feet each. Perfect. I dragged the pipes out to the center of the deck, setting them on 2 sawhorses. The plan was simple in concept, difficult in execution. Turn the round pipes into gutters, mount them to the eaves of the wheelhouse, and route the flow into a reservoir inside the cabin. I picked up my angle grinder. I did not have a cutting disc for plastic, just a masonry wheel and a metal cutting wheel. The metal wheel would melt the PVC rather than cut it if I was not careful. I checked the battery on the grinder. 2 bars. I marked a line down the center of the first pipe using a piece of angle iron as a straight edge. I clamped the pipe to the sawhorse. Zzz! The grinder screamed, biting into the white plastic. A plume of acrid white dust puffed up, smelling of chlorine. I moved fast, letting the wheel glide just fast enough to cut without fusing the kerf back together behind the blade.
I sliced the 10-foot pipe in half lengthwise, creating 2 C-shaped channels. I repeated the process with the second pipe. Now I had 20 feet of gutter. I carried the halves up the ladder to the wheelhouse catwalk.
The wind was gusting, threatening to rip the light plastic sections from my grip. I had to secure them to the roof edge. I could not drill into the roof itself. A leak over the instrument panel would be a disaster. I had to use the existing overhang. I used a pair of vice grips to bend the aluminum drip edge of the roof slightly upward, creating a lip. Then, I drilled holes through the top edge of my PVC gutters every 12 inches. I did not have gutter hooks, so I improvised with galvanized baling wire. I threaded the wire through the PVC, looped it over the existing roof screws, and twisted it tight with my lineman's pliers. The work was slow. My gloves were too bulky for the fine motor skills needed to twist the wire, so I had to work barehanded. The cold metal sucked the heat from my fingertips until they felt like sausages, clumsy and numb. I dropped a pair of pliers. They clattered on the steel grating of the catwalk and bounced once, twice, and stopped at the edge. I stared at them, my heart hammering. If they had fallen into the river, I would have lost 10% of my gripping capability. I breathed on my hands, rubbing them together until the sting of circulation returned. Focus. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. I mounted the gutters on both the port and starboard sides of the roof, pitching them slightly toward the rear of the cabin. Now I had to join them. I needed a manifold. I took the third, uncut length of PVC and cut a 2-foot section. I drilled 2 large holes in it to accept the flow from the side gutters. I used a tube of marine-grade silicone sealant, the kind that smells like vinegar and cures into a rubber tougher than a car tire, to glue the joints. It was not pretty. It looked like a plumber's nightmare, a Frankenstein of white plastic and clear goo, but it was watertight. Now came the critical part, the filtration logic. The roof was covered in months of seagull droppings, dust, and diesel particulate. The first few gallons of rain would wash that filth down the gutters. I could not drink that. I needed a first flush diverter. I went back to the locker and found a 3-inch T-junction and a length of narrower 1-inch pipe. I constructed a vertical drop leg. The logic was gravity. Water flows from the roof into the T-junction. Gravity pulls it down into the vertical 1-inch pipe first. This pipe is capped at the bottom. The first gallon of dirty water fills this sacrificial pipe. Inside this pipe, I placed a ping-pong ball I found in the lost and found box. Someone had been playing beer pong on the ferry last summer. As the dirty water fills the vertical pipe, the ping-pong ball floats up. When the pipe is full, the ball jams against a rubber seal I cut from an old inner tube at the top of the T-junction, sealing off the dirty water. The subsequent clean water, having nowhere else to go, flows out the side of the T-junction. It took me 2 hours to fabricate the seal. I had to use a hole saw to cut a precise circle in a PVC end cap, then sand it smooth with 400 grit emery cloth so the ball would seat perfectly. If the seal was not tight, the dirty water would mix with the clean. I checked the fitment over and over, testing it by blowing air through the valve. It had to be airtight. Finally, I routed the output. I drilled a hole through the aluminum wall of the wheelhouse, painful to violate the hull integrity, but necessary. I ran a 1/2-inch flexible clear hose from the diverter through the wall and into a 30-gallon plastic storage tote I had scrubbed with bleach and placed in the corner of the cabin. I stood back and looked at the rig. It was ugly. It vibrated in the wind. But it was a machine. It had input, processing, and output. I stepped inside the wheelhouse and checked the barometer on the wall. The needle was dropping. The pressure was 2980 inches Hargree. Low pressure system incoming.
Rain was coming. My stomach growled, a hollow, cramping sensation. I ignored it and turned to the second problem: thermodynamics. The wheelhouse was a single-pane aluminum box. In the summer, it was an oven. Now it was a freezer. I had the small electric heater, but running it off the batteries drained them fast.
To keep the batteries charged, I had to run the Kubota generator. The Kubota was a reliable little diesel engine, but it was loud. On the open water, sound carries. The chug, chug, chug of the generator would be a dinner bell for every infected within 2 miles. They could not swim, but they could congregate on the shore, and eventually, someone, living or dead, might figure out how to navigate a boat. I needed to muffle the sound. I went down to the engine room hatch. The main engines were housed below deck, but the generator was up top, in a ventilated steel box behind the wheelhouse. It was shielded from rain, but not for sound. I needed mass. Mass stops sound waves. I scavenged the ferry's life jacket locker. There were 50 orange Type 2 PFDs, crusty, stiff foam blocks encased in nylon. I was not planning on taking passengers, so they were raw materials. I cut them open. The foam inside was dense. I used a serrated bread knife from my lunchbox to slice the foam into flat panels. I disassembled the steel enclosure of the generator. I lined the interior walls with the foam, using spray adhesive to tack it in place. But foam alone is not enough. It absorbs high frequencies, but lets the low rumble pass through. I needed a decoupler. I found a roll of heavy rubber floor matting in the storage locker. I cut it to size and glued it over the foam. Now I had a composite armor. Steel, foam, rubber. The mass spring mass principle. But an engine needs to breathe. If I sealed it completely, it would suffocate and stall, or overheat and catch fire. I had to build a baffled intake and exhaust. I built a snake box out of plywood scrap. Picture a maze. Air enters at one end, hits a wall, turns 180 degrees, hits another wall, turns again, and finally enters the engine intake. Every time the sound wave hits a wall lined with foam, it loses energy. I spent 3 hours cutting plywood. My hands were blistered. The sun had set behind the heavy cloud layer, turning the sky a bruised charcoal. I was working by the light of a single LED headlamp. The world had narrowed to the illuminated circle of my work, the grain of the wood, the tip of the screw, the bead of glue. I finished the baffle box and screwed it onto the intake vent. I did the same for the exhaust fan, careful to keep the hot exhaust pipe isolated so it would not melt the foam. It was time to test. I pressed the start button on the Kubota. The starter whined and the diesel caught. Usually it sounded like a lawnmower. Now it was a hum, a dull, throbbing vibration that you could feel more than hear. From 10 feet away, against the sound of the wind and the river, it was almost imperceptible. I checked the temperature gauge. It was rising, but stable. The airflow was sufficient. I climbed back into the wheelhouse. It was 2200 hours. I was exhausted. My muscles felt like they were filled with lead shot. I sat on the floor, leaning against the plastic tote bin, waiting. And then it started. A single plink against the aluminum roof. Then another. Then a drum roll. The squall hit with the fury of the Pacific Northwest. Rain lashed against the windows, blurring the fires on the shore into streaky orange ghosts. I held my breath and listened to the PVC pipes outside. Drip, drip, trickle. I heard the water rushing into the gutters. I heard the gurgle as it hit the T-junction. I waited.
The first flush had to fill up that sacrificial gallon of filth. Minutes passed. The suspense was worse than the silence. Had the seal failed? Was the dirty water leaking into the tote? And then, a sound. A clear, steady stream of water pouring from the hose into the plastic tote bin. Splosh, splosh, splosh. I shined my flashlight into the bin. The water was clear. No bird guano, no soot. Just cold, distilled atmospheric water. I watched the water level rise. 1 inch, 2 inches. I grabbed my tin cup. I did not wait to boil it. I knew I should, but the primal animal in my brain overrode the engineer. I dipped the cup into the stream. The water was freezing. It tasted like metal and plastic and ozone. It was the best thing I had ever drunk. I drank the whole cup, then another. I could feel my cells rehydrating, the headache behind my eyes receding slightly. I sat back against the wall, listening to the generator hum and the water splash.
I had power. I had water. I had a fortress of steel floating on a river of death. I looked at the dashboard. The voltage meter was climbing. 25.2 volts. I had bought myself time. But as I looked out the window at the dark shape of the bridge downstream, I knew time was not the only thing I needed. I needed a purpose, because surviving was not the same as living. And looking at the empty passenger manifest on the clipboard, the silence of the ferry felt heavier than the machinery. I closed my eyes, but I did not sleep. I listened to the rain, calculating the volume per hour, because if I stopped calculating, I would have to start feeling. And I was not ready for that yet. The river did not just rise, it swelled. It was a hydrostatic bloating, as if the earth beneath the channel was bruising and pushing the water upward. 72 hours into the isolation, the Willamette had ceased to be a river and had become a conveyance system for the wreckage of Central Oregon. The atmospheric river, a meteorological term for a fire hose of tropical moisture aimed at the Pacific Northwest, had stalled over the Cascades. The result was a hydraulic hammer driving millions of acre-feet of meltwater and mud into the valley floor. I sat in the wheelhouse, watching the tension gauge on the upstream cable. The needle was vibrating near the red zone. The cable itself, a 1-inch galvanized steel wire rope, was no longer humming. It was screaming. A high-pitched, resonant keening that cut through the sound of the rain and the diesel generator like a dentist's drill hitting a nerve. Every vibration of that cable transferred directly into the hull of the Marie E, rattling the coffee cup on the dashboard, shaking the tools on the bench, vibrating the fillings in my teeth. The ferry was bucking against the current, held in place only by the sheer strength of the grade 8 bolt I had jammed into the winch gears 3 days ago. I was running the math in my head, over and over. The braking strength of a 1-inch IWRC independent wire rope core cable is roughly 40 tons. The safe working load is 1/5 of that. We were well past the safe working load. We were entering the plastic deformation range, where the steel strands stretch and do not snap back. If the upstream cable snapped, the ferry would swing violently downstream on the remaining cable. The sudden shock load would snap the second cable instantly. Then, I would be free drifting in a dark, debris-choked flood at 10 knots, heading toward the concrete pylons of the Independence Bridge, or what was left of it. I needed to relieve the strain. But to do that, I would have to slack the winch. To slack the winch, I had to remove the locking bolt. To remove the bolt, I had to take the tension off the gears. It was a catch-22 of forces. Then the impact happened.
It was not a sharp crash.
It was a dull, shuddering thud that felt like the ferry had run aground. The entire vessel listed 10 degrees to port, throwing me out of the captain's chair. The coffee cup smashed against the bulkhead. The high-pitched singing of the cable stopped instantly, replaced by a terrifying, low-frequency groan. I scrambled up, grabbing the spotlight. I shone the beam out the upstream window. A mat had hit us. In logging terms, a mat is a tangled island of debris, whole trees, root wads, pieces of dock and trash woven together by the current into a solid raft. This one was the size of a tennis court. It had snagged on the upstream guide cable, pinning the steel rope against the hull of the ferry. The river was now pushing against the ferry and the debris mat. The surface area resisting the current had just tripled. The hull groaned. Somewhere deep in the steel, a weld popped with a sound like a gunshot. I grabbed my radio, purely out of habit, then threw it down. No one was coming. I needed to clear the debris. Now. I pulled on my rain gear, heavy PVC bibs and a jacket that smelled of old fish. I grabbed my hard hat with the mounted headlamp. I went to the tool locker and bypassed the wrenches. I reached for the steel MS-460 Magnum chainsaw. It was a beast of a saw, equipped with a 32-inch bar and a skip-tooth chain designed for falling big timber. I checked the fluids. Gas was full. Bar oil was empty. Damn it. I did not have bar oil. I grabbed a quart of 15W40 motor oil from the generator supplies and poured it into the reservoir. It would fling off faster and smoke like hell, but it would keep the bar from seizing for a few minutes. I stepped out of the wheelhouse into the gale. The rain was horizontal, stinging like birdshot. The deck was slick with algae and oil. I clipped a safety tether to the railing. If I went overboard in this current, with this gear on, I would sink like a stone anchor. I fought my way to the upstream rail, the spotlight being cut through the driving rain, illuminating the mess. It was worse than I thought. A massive Douglas fir, complete with a root ball the size of a Volkswagen, was the anchor of the mat. Its branches were hopelessly tangled with the ferry's steel guide cable. The tension was so great that the tree trunk was bowing, storing kinetic energy like a giant drawn bow. And there was something else. Caught in the branches of the fir tree, trapped waist-deep in the debris, was a figure. It was wearing a tattered red flannel shirt. One arm was pinned under a heavy limb. As the light hit it, the head snapped up. The eyes were clouded white cataracts. The skin was gray and sloughing off in the water. It saw me. It opened its mouth and gnashed its teeth, a mindless, mechanical snapping motion. It did not scream. It just thrashed, driving the tree limbs harder against the cable. It was not a person. It was just another piece of hazardous debris. I assessed the physics. I could not cut the cable, that was suicide. I had to cut the tree. But if I cut the trunk, the tension in the cable would release instantly. The tree would snap upward and the cable would whip back. If I was standing in the wrong spot, the cable would cut me in half. If the tree kicked the wrong way, it would crush me against the railing. I had to buck the log, cut it into sections, starting from the far end to reduce the weight, and then carefully sever the piece trapping the cable. I climbed over the railing. My boots found purchase on the slimy bark of the fir tree. The log bobbed and rolled under my weight. The river rushed beneath me, black and violent, hissing through the branches. I was 3 feet above death. I balanced on the trunk, spreading my feet for stability. The infected thing was 10 feet away, thrashing toward me, snarling. The vibration of its movement traveled through the wood into my boots. I pulled the starter cord on the steel. The engine sputtered.
cold. "Come on, you piece of junk," I hissed. I set the choke, planted my boot on the handle, and ripped the cord again. The saw roared to life, a jagged, angry sound that drowned out the river. Blue smoke from the burning motor oil puffed from the exhaust. I revved the engine to warm it up. The infected thing reacted to the noise, thrashing harder, ripping its own arm to get free.
I ignored it. Problem first. I moved to the first stress point, a thick branch levering against the hull. I brought the spinning chain down. Wood chips flew, wet and heavy, sticking to my face shield. The saw ate through the limb in seconds. Crack! The branch gave way, and the log shifted violently. I dropped to one knee, digging my cack boots into the bark. The ferry lurched. The tension on the cable dropped slightly, but the main mass was still pinned. I had to get closer to the root ball, closer to the thing in the red flannel. I crab-walked along the trunk. The infected man, or what used to be a man, was clawing at the air, snapping its jaws inches from my boot. I looked at the geometry of the tangle. The cable was buried deep in the root structure. I could not cut the roots. They were full of rocks and dirt that would dough my chain in seconds. I had to sever the trunk just behind the root ball, separating the mass from the buoyancy of the log. It was a bind cut. The tree was under compression on top and tension on the bottom. If I cut from the top down, the saw would get pinched as the wood compressed. I had to cut from the bottom up, and undercut. This meant leaning over the edge of the log, holding the 20-pound saw upside down, inches above the rushing water. I locked my legs around the trunk. I leaned over. The river spray hit my face. I revved the saw. The chain bit into the underside of the wet wood. The motor bogged down, then screamed as it found torque. Sawdust sprayed into the water. The infected thing lunged. It had torn its arm free. It scrambled over the root wad, dragging a useless, mangled limb. It grabbed my ankle with its good hand. The grip was shockingly strong, like a vice grip tightening. I did not scream. I did not have the air for it. I kicked backward with my free boot, slamming the steel toe into its face. Bone crunched. It did not let go. It pulled, dragging me toward the water. The saw was still running, idling in my hand. I had a choice. Drop the saw and fight the creature, or finish the cut. If I dropped the saw, the ferry might break loose before I could kill the thing. Competence. Leverage. Physics. I jammed the bumper spikes of the chainsaw into the wood to stabilize myself. I could not reach the creature with the bar without cutting my own leg. I looked at the hand gripping my ankle. It was a mechanical linkage, a biological clamp. I shifted my weight, driving my knee into the log to pin myself. I took my left hand off the saw's forward handle, controlling the heavy machine with just my right hand on the trigger, a dangerous, reckless maneuver. I reached down to my belt and unclipped a heavy steel rigger's carabiner. I slammed the carabiner onto the creature's wrist, trapping the flannel fabric and the tendon. I clipped the other end to the logging chain wrapped around the root wad. Now it was anchored to the debris it loved so much. I kicked again, harder. The grip broke. The creature slid back, tethered to the root ball. I grabbed the saw with both hands. I throttled up. "Going away!" I yelled to no one. I drove the bar upward through the cut. The wood groaned. The fibers began to tear. I saw the kerf opening. Crack! Whoosh! The trunk snapped. The buoyancy of the log kicked the main section up. The root wad, heavy with rocks and the tangled creature, dropped like a stone. The cable, suddenly released from the immense weight,
whipped out of the water. Snap! It missed my head by inches, the steel rope striking the chainsaw bar. Sparks showered like magnesium. The impact tore the saw from my grip. I watched the steel MS-460 tumble into the black water, the engine dying instantly. I threw myself flat on the log as the ferry recoiled. The hull swung back into the channel, free of the dam. The log I was riding was no longer pinned. It was free-floating, spinning in the eddy. I was drifting away from the ferry. Panic flared, hot and white. The gap was 5 feet, 6 feet. The current was pulling the log downstream toward the ocean. I scrambled to the end of the log. The safety tether. I had clipped it to the ferry's railing before I climbed over. I grabbed the nylon webbing. It was taut, stretched to its limit. I was a fish on a line. I pulled. My muscles burned, lactic acid flooding my arms.
I hand-over-handed the webbing, dragging the wet log and myself back toward the hull. The ferry was rocking violently in the wake of the release. I reached the gunwale. I threw a leg over. I collapsed onto the diamond plate deck, gasping, coughing up bile and river water. I lay there for a long time, the rain washing the sawdust and slime off my rain gear. The sound of the river had changed. The high-pitched scream of the cable was gone. The low groan of the hull had ceased. There was only the rhythmic slap, slap, slap of the water and the steady thrum of the Kubota generator. I rolled over and looked at the winch. The grade 8 bolt was bent at a 45-degree angle, but it had held. I stood up, my legs trembling uncontrollably. Adrenaline crash. I walked to the rail and looked downstream. In the beam of the spotlight, I saw the root wad bob once in the turbulence, 50 yards away. The red flannel shirt was gone, pulled under by the weight of the sodden wood. I checked the tension gauge. 8 tons. Safe working load. I went into the wheelhouse and locked the door. I slid the deadbolt screwdriver into place. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold it. I stripped off the wet gear, leaving it in a pile in the corner. I was freezing, hypothermia clawing at my core. I turned the electric heater on high. I sat on the floor, hugging my knees, shivering violently. I had lost the chainsaw. That was a critical failure. A tool like that was irreplaceable. I mentally reprimanded myself for the loss, improper grip, failure to secure equipment. But the ferry was still here. The cable held. The anchor held. I looked at my hands. They were covered in grease, pine pitch, and blood that was not mine. I stood up and went to the sink I had jury-rigged to the rain barrel. I pumped the foot pedal. Clear, cold water flowed. I scrubbed my hands with abrasive mechanic soap, scrubbing until the skin was raw and red, until every trace of the gray matter was gone. I dried my hands on a shop towel. I picked up the logbook. My handwriting was jagged. Date, November 17th. Time, 02:30 hours. Event, debris impact, guide cable fouled. Action, cleared obstruction manually. Losses, steel MS-460 chainsaw. Status, operational. I stared at the word operational. I was not a warrior. I had not defeated the enemy. I had simply unclogged a drain. I had performed maintenance. I looked out the window at the dark, rushing water. The river did not care. The cable did not care. The infected thing did not care. It was all just forces and vectors. I lay down on the bench seat, wrapping myself in a wool blanket. I listened to the rain on the roof, channeling into the gutters, filling my tanks.
The system worked. But as I closed my eyes, I could still feel the phantom sensation of that cold, gray hand gripping my ankle. It was not the fear of being eaten that kept me awake.
It was the realization that the creature had once been a man who probably wore flannel and drove a truck. And in the end, he was just debris. Just mass to be cut away to save the machine. I pulled the blanket over my head. I needed to sleep. Tomorrow, I had to replace the bent locking bolt. I had to sharpen the spare machete since the saw was gone. There was work to do. Always work. Time ceased to be measured in days or weeks. The Gregorian calendar is a social construct, useful for coordinating meetings and holidays, neither of which existed anymore. Instead, I measured my life in engine hours, amp hours, and calories. The winter in the Willamette Valley did not end. It just faded into a lighter shade of gray. The relentless horizontal rain softened into a pervasive, misting drizzle that coated everything in a bioluminescent green film. Moss was growing on the north side of the winch housing. Algae slicked the diamond plate deck where I did not walk frequently. The ferry was becoming part of the river ecosystem, a steel island slowly being reclaimed by the temperate rainforest. I had developed a routine. Routine is the psychological anchor that prevents the drift into madness. Without a schedule, the silence amplifies the thoughts you should not have. 6. Wake up. The temperature in the wheelhouse is usually 45 degrees Fahrenheit. 6:15. Systems check. Battery voltage. Water level in the tote. Visual inspection of the anchor bolt. 6:30. Calisthenics. Push-ups and squats on the deck. Atrophy is a death sentence. 7 elec. Ration check. 8 elec. Maintenance. The maintenance was constant. Corrosion is the metabolism of the machine world. It never sleeps. I spent hours every day armed with a wire brush and a can of rust converter, hunting the orange blooms on the steel. I greased the cable guides daily, hoarding the precious tub of molybdenum disulfide grease like it was gold dust. If the cable frayed, I died. If the pulleys seized, I died. But the real enemy was not rust. It was the fuel gauge. The Kubota generator was a marvel of Japanese engineering, but it drank diesel. Even with my aggressive rationing, running it only 1 hour a day to top off the battery bank, the 500-gallon main tank was dropping. I dipped the stick yesterday. 380 gallons. That sounded like a lot. It was not. It was a countdown clock. When the diesel ran out, the batteries would die. When the batteries died, the lights went out. The bilge pumps stopped. The radio died. I would be sitting in the dark, cold silence. I needed renewable energy. I did not have solar panels. The Oregon sky was a lid of lead clouds 9 months out of the year anyway. I needed something mechanical. I looked at the river. The current was steady, about 4 knots. I had thought about a water wheel, but the debris risk was too high. Another log mat would smash a paddle wheel to splinters. I looked at the wind. It channeled down the river valley, funneling between the tree lines like a wind tunnel. It was constant, reliable, and free. I decided to build a vertical axis wind turbine, VAWT. The materials inventory was meager, but sufficient. I had an empty 55-gallon drum of hydraulic fluid. I had a spare 24-volt alternator meant for the main Detroit diesel engine. I had angle iron and a box of pillow block bearings. I dragged the empty drum to the center of the deck. The project began with deconstruction. I used a cold chisel and a hammer to cut the top and bottom lids off the drum. The noise rang out across the water. Clank, clank,
clank, a rhythmic industrial bell. I did not care who heard. The infected on the shore had long since lost interest in me. I was just background noise, like the wind or the birds. Once the lids were off, I marked a line vertically down the cylinder. I switched to the hacksaw. The angle grinder battery was dead, and I was not going to burn diesel to charge it for a 5-minute cut. I sawed by hand. The blade bit into the steel, the friction warming the metal. It took 2 hours to split the drum into 2 curved C-shaped halves. These were my scoops. A Savonius rotor design. It relies on drag, not lift. It's not efficient, but it produces massive torque and starts in low wind.
It's the AK-47 of wind turbines. Ugly, heavy, and impossible to kill. I needed a central shaft. I cannibalized a length of 1.5-inch steel pipe from the railing. I drilled holes through the pipe and bolted the drum halves to it, offsetting them so they formed an S shape when viewed from above. Next, the tower. I welded, using the ship's batteries and a set of jumper cables with a welding rod clamped in the positive grip, a frame of angle iron. It was a crude stick welding job. The arc sputtered and popped, leaving messy slag, but the penetration was deep. I mounted the pillow block bearings at the top and bottom of the frame. I slid the rotor shaft into the bearings. I gave it a spin. It rotated smoothly, the heavy steel drums carrying momentum. Whum, whum, whum. Now the power conversion. The alternator needs high RPM to generate current. The wind turbine spins slowly but with high torque. I needed a transmission. I scavenged the belt drive system from a broken ventilation fan in the engine room. A large pulley on the turbine shaft, a small pulley on the alternator. A 10-to-1 ratio. I mounted the alternator to the base of the frame, using a slotted bracket to tension the V-belt. I wired the alternator into the FERRY's charging circuit. This required bypassing the internal voltage regulator, which was designed for a 2,000 RPM diesel engine, and building a simple rectifier circuit using diodes I stripped from an old control panel. I waited for the afternoon gust. It came around 1400, rippling the gray surface of the water. The turbine shuddered. The drum halves caught the air. It began to turn. Creak. Whoosh. It picked up speed. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The belt whined. I watched the multimeter in the wheelhouse. The voltage on the battery bank was sitting at 23.8 volts. As the turbine spun up, the needle twitched. 24 volts, 24.2 volts, 24.5 volts. It was not a torrent of power, it was a trickle, about 5 amps. But it was constant. As long as the wind blew, I was harvesting energy. I was not burning the past, diesel. I was harvesting the present. I sat back in the captain's chair, watching the spinning drums. It was hypnotic, a kinetic sculpture of survival. With the energy crisis stabilized, my mind turned to the biological crisis. Protein. I had been surviving on canned beans and the dwindling supply of dry goods. I was losing weight. My belt was on its last hole. I could see the definition of my radius and ulna when I rotated my wrist. The river was full of life. I could see them sometimes, carp and suckers rolling in the slack water near the hull. I could not fish with a rod. Standing at the rail for hours was inefficient and exposed me to snipers on the shore. Unlikely, but paranoia is a survival trait. I needed a passive trap. I built a trot line. I stripped the copper wire from a spool of 12-gauge Romex cable. I twisted the strands to make leaders. For hooks, I did not have tackle. I used safety pins from the first aid kit, cutting off the clasp and filing the point to a needle sharpness, then bending a barb into the wire with needle nose pliers. Bait was the problem. You need meat to catch meat. I found a dead crow on the roof of the wheelhouse one morning. It had died of natural causes or disease. I did not eat it, too risky. Instead, I used it. I cut it into strips, the smell making my empty stomach heave. I set the line off the stern, weighing it down with a heavy shackle. The next morning, the line was taut. I pulled it in hand over hand. The resistance was heavy, a thrashing, living weight. I hauled a 12-pound carp onto the deck. It was an ugly fish, gold scales dulled by the murky water, a sucker mouth gasping for oxygen. To me, it looked like a ribeye steak. I killed it quickly with a hammer blow. I cleaned it on the deck, washing the blood into the scuppers. I filleted the meat, checking carefully for parasites. I could not eat it raw, and frying it used too much oil. I built a smoker. I took a steel locker, drilled vents in the bottom and top. I arranged the fillets on the wire shelves inside. For fuel, I used hickory handles from broken hammers and axes, shaved into chips. I lit a small, smoldering fire in a coffee can at the bottom of the locker. 6 hours later, I ate. The fish was smoky, oily, and tasted faintly of mud. It was exquisite. The fat coated my tongue. I could feel the energy hitting my bloodstream, the dizziness of starvation receding for the first time in weeks. I saved the skin and the guts. Bait for tomorrow. The cycle was closed. By the 4th month, the silence had changed texture. In the beginning, the silence was terrifying because it was empty. It was the absence of traffic, of sirens, of voices. Now, the silence was full. It was textured with the sounds of the structure and the river. I knew the Marie E like I knew my own body. I knew that when the temperature dropped below 40 degrees, the starboard railing contracted and popped at 3. I knew that the wind turbine developed a harmonic rattle at 15 knots. I spent hours observing the shore through a pair of Nikon binoculars I found in the Lost and Found. The city was dissolving. Without maintenance, entropy was winning fast. The fires had burned out weeks ago. Now it was just rot. I watched a roof on a warehouse collapse under the weight of wet moss. I watched the blackberry brambles swallow the abandoned cars on the ramp. The infected were changing too. In the early days, they were frantic, sprinting at any sound. Now, they were sluggish. They huddled together in the lee of buildings, conserving heat. They were starving, just like everything else. I saw them stumble and fall, and not get up. Nature was selecting against them. They were a failed evolutionary branch, burning calories they could not replace. I felt a strange kinship with them. We were both just trying to keep our metabolic furnaces burning in a world that had run out of fuel. One afternoon, in late March, the sun broke through. It was a shock. A shaft of pure, hard sunlight pierced the clouds and hit the water, turning the black river into blinding chrome. I stepped out of the wheelhouse. The warmth on my face was startling. I closed my eyes, tilting my head back, letting the photons hit my retina. I looked upstream. The snowpack on the Cascades was visible, a jagged white line on the horizon. The melt was coming. The river would rise again. I checked the anchor bolt. It was holding. I checked the wind turbine. Spinning. I checked the smoker. 2 fish curing. I realized then that I was not waiting for rescue. Rescue implies a return to a previous state. That state did not exist anymore. There was no Coast Guard cutter coming around the bend. There was no radio transmission. I walked to the logbook. The pages were filling up.
a chronicle of volts, amps, fish, and rain. I picked up the pen. Date, March 24th. System status, nominal. Power, 100% charge. Food reserves, 3 days. Morale, stable. I put the pen down. I looked at the shore. I could lower the dinghy. I could row to the bank. I could walk away. I could try to find people. I looked at the ferry, my fortress, my machine.
I had built the gutters. I had built the turbine. I had secured the perimeter. I had solved the equation of survival. To leave would be to introduce variables, randomness, chaos. Here, I had control. I went back to the wheelhouse and sat in the chair. I poured a cup of water I had harvested from the sky, filtered through a system I designed. I took a sip. I was not a victim of the collapse. I was the curator of this specific coordinate. I was the mechanic of the Middle River. I watched the sun set behind the silhouette of the ruined bridge. The wind picked up, and the turbine whined, a rising pitch that sounded almost like a voice. "Copy that," I whispered. I opened a technical manual for the Detroit Diesel 671, turning to the section on injector timing. I had read it 50 times. I started reading it again. The world had ended. The ferry was just fine. The ear is a muscle that can be trained. Over 6 months, my hearing had tuned itself to the specific acoustic signature of the river valley. I could distinguish the splash of a leaping sturgeon from the clumsy, heavy fall of an infected stumbling off the bank. I knew the wind shear noise of a storm front 3 hours before it arrived. So, when I heard the engine, I knew instantly that it was running rich. It was a 2-stroke whine, high and reedy, interrupted by a rhythmic sputtering. Put, die, put. Someone was feathering the throttle, trying to keep a fouled carburetor from choking out. I was in the middle of my Tuesday maintenance cycle, stripping the oxidation off the battery terminals with a baking soda paste when the sound drifted up from the south bend. I did not scramble. Sudden movements offer prey. I wiped my hands on a rag, capped the distilled water jug, and walked calmly to the wheelhouse. I picked up the binoculars. The boat came around the bend a mile out. It was a 16-foot aluminum Lund, the kind used for bass fishing on lazy Sundays. It was overloaded. The freeboard was dangerously low. I counted 4 heads. I checked my defenses. The perimeter chains were deployed. The porcupine quill rails were sharp. The ferry was sitting midstream, a fortress of steel and silence. The approaching boat was a chaos of motion. 2 figures were rowing frantically against the current, their oars out of sync. A third was fiddling with the outboard motor at the stern. The fourth was standing in the bow, holding a rifle. I unlocked the gun cabinet, a heavy steel job box bolted to the floor. Inside was the shotgun the driver had left in his truck on day 1. I had cleaned it, oiled it, and counted the shells. 12 rounds of double-aught buckshot. I racked a shell into the chamber. The sound, clack, clack, was loud in the small cabin. I did not aim the weapon. I set it on the console, visible but not threatened. I picked up the megaphone, a red plastic bullhorn I'd salvaged from the emergency locker. The aluminum boat was 200 yards out. The current was pushing them toward my port side. The engine died completely. The rower on the left missed a stroke, and the boat slewed sideways. "Hold your drift!" I amplified my voice. The electronic distortion rolled over the water. The figure in the bow jerked, nearly dropping the rifle. They had not seen me inside the shadowed wheelhouse. They were looking at the wind turbine,
staring at the spinning drums like they were seeing magic. "Who's there?" the man in the bow shouted. His voice was thin, eaten by the wind. "This is a restricted utility vessel," I said. "Do not attempt to board. The hull is electrified." It was not, of course. That would be a waste of amperage. But they did not know that. The current pushed them closer. They were 50 yards away now. I could see their faces through the binoculars. Gaunt, sunken eyes. The look of people who had spent the winter running, not building. Their clothes were layered filth. "We need help," the man yelled. He lowered the rifle slightly. "Our motor died. We have women on board. We need food." "Your motor did not die," I said, my voice calm, analytical. "It flooded. You're running a 50-to-1 mix in a pre-mix engine that looks like it has not been tuned since the 90s. You fouled the plugs."
The mechanic at the back of their boat looked up, surprised. He was wearing a greasy baseball cap. "It just quit on us." "Pull the cowl," I ordered. "Take out the plugs. Burn the tips with a lighter. Dry crank the cylinders to clear the flood. Then try it." They stared at me. The boat drifted closer. 30 yards. "We do not have a lighter," the mechanic yelled back. "We're out of butane." I looked at the shotgun. Then I looked at the trot line. I had 3 smoked carp fillets wrapped in wax paper on the counter. I made a decision. Not out of charity, but out of pragmatism. If they drifted into my anchor cables, they could foul the line. If they panicked and tried to board, I'd have to shoot them. Bodies are a biohazard. Cleanup takes calories. "I'm going to lower a bucket," I announced. "Do not touch the chain. Do not touch the hull. If you touch the hull, I drop the voltage." I walked out to the catwalk. I tied the wax paper package and a cheap disposable Bic lighter into a plastic bucket attached to a paracord line. I lowered it down as they drifted past. The man in the bow reached for it. "Do not grab the rope," I barked. "Let it touch the deck." He recoiled. The bucket clattered onto the aluminum floor of their boat. He scrambled for it, tearing open the paper. The smell of smoked fish wafted up. He shoved a piece into his mouth, barely chewing. "The lighter is for the plugs," I said. "Not for your cigarettes." The mechanic grabbed the lighter. He popped the engine cover. I watched him work. He was clumsy. He stripped the spark plug wire boot because he pulled the wire, not the boot. Amateur. "Gap them while you're at it," I said. "Use your thumbnail. It's about 30 thousandths." He looked up, nodding frantically. He held the flame of the lighter to the wet, black electrode of the spark plug. The gas burned off with a small poof. He screwed it back in. He pulled the starter cord. Sputter. "Choke off," I yelled. "You're already rich." He pushed the choke in. Pulled again. Roar! The mercury outboard caught life. A cloud of blue smoke erupted. The engine settled into a rough, unhappy idle. The boat captain looked up at me. He looked at the ferry. He looked at the wind turbine spinning silently, the rain gutters, the clean glass of the wheelhouse. "Hey!" he shouted over the engine. "You got a setup here. We got a camp down in Albany, about 50 of us. We got walls. We need guys who know stuff. Come with us." I looked at their boat. It was a mess of unsecured gear, rusty tools, a cooler lid held down with duct tape, a rifle that showed visible orange rust on the receiver. They were survivors, but they were not sustaining. They were scavenging the corpse of the old world, eating the marrow until it ran dry. "No," I said. "Why?" The man looked genuinely confused. "You're all alone out here. The herds are migrating north. It's gonna get bad.
I'm not alone, I said, tapping the hull of the ferry. I'm anchored.
We can tow you. Cut the cables.
I looked at the tension gauge. I looked at the grade 8 locking bolt. I looked at the systems I had bled to build. Go, I said. Keep the RPMs high. If you idle, you'll foul it again. The man stared at me for a long moment. He shook his head, spitting into the water. Suit yourself, wizard. Enjoy the rust. He slammed the throttle forward. The boat surged, the bow rising. They banked hard, heading downstream toward the chaotic, broken remnants of the I-5 bridge. I watched them go until the sound of their engine faded into the ambient noise of the river. I did not feel lonely. I felt a profound sense of relief. They were chaos. They were variables. They introduced friction into the system. I walked back into the wheelhouse. I picked up the logbook. Date, April 2nd. Event, vessel contact. Action, technical assistance provided. Perimeter maintained. Expenditure, 1 Bic lighter, 3 fillets. Status, secure. I sat down. The wind picked up. The voltage meter climbed to 25.5 volts. I realized then that the ferry was not just a shelter. It was a filter. It kept the entropy out. The world outside was breaking down, rusting rifles, fouling plugs, rotting bodies. Inside the rails, things worked. Because I made them work.
I opened the tool drawer. I took out a set of feeler gauges and a micrometer. The generator was due for a valve lash adjustment at 1,000 hours. I was at 998. I did not wait. I picked up the wrench. There was work to do.